thanks to Dennis as well for getting me up to speed, and others who have helped me get up to speed on this adventure. And today, I'm going to try and do maybe 4 things, which is probably one thing too many. But I just give a basic roadmap. I think what I'd like to do is talk a bit about the title and focus a little bit on where I see the world heading right now, what we mean when we say the word Anthropocene. Then I want to talk quite a bit around what that says about how we do our research and how we create a voice for science in an increasingly crowded marketplace of ideas. I then want to sort of go back a bit to my roots and talk some about how ecology as a discipline has or has not been changing in response to pressures that are brought on by the Anthropocene. And then, because I just can't not do it, I have to sort of spend a little time talking about natural history, because that's also core to my value system. And I will see what I can get through in a day. Today I think I can get through most of this. So to me, the Anthropocene is all about change. It's about the speed of change. And whether we're talking about where we live, how we get our food, our energy, our water, how we create commodities and that will go from a raw product to a finished good, and the impacts that has on the planet, the pace of change, creating feedbacks that are impacting people all over the globe, locally, regionally, nationally, globally. But the impacts of the Anthropocene depend a lot on where you sit, where you come from. And I would say, on balance, it's a really good day to be a human. I mean, it's actually, I mean, the human footprint is everywhere. But for most of humanity, this influence has had a powerful, positive impact on the world. And people around the world are living longer and better lives, really, than any time in human history. And it's important to keep that in mind, I think, as we enter into the Anthropocene. We are making some progress in this space. We've gotten better at doing what we're doing over the last 100 years. And so we've managed to quadruple the human population, increase global GDP by about 17-fold, and do that with only extracting about double the amount of the terrestrial biomass production as we did previously, from about 13 to 25%. So our efficiency is increasing significantly. We're supporting more people on the planet. And in the last 20 years, this has been a time of particular progress. This is unprecedented economic and social progress. With real incomes of low to middle income countries doubling, poverty rates going in half, declines in malnourishment, declines in maternal mortality. All of these sort of things point to a place in which humanity has gone through significant social and economic transformations at a scale that really we have not seen before in the history of the planet. These trends have to be acknowledged as we move, but these are not the trends that worry scientists, I think, most about the Anthropocene and about the influence of humans on the planet and those potential feedbacks. I think the 2 big issues boil down to resource scarcity, or perceived resource scarcity, and inequality. And so currently, we've used a tidy 50% of the terrestrial surface of the Earth, a little more than that of all the fresh water. And in doing that, in that appropriation of these resources, we're still really not meeting our needs. We've got over 1 billion people without enough water, we've got over 1 billion people without enough food, we've got over 1 billion people without enough electricity. These issues, as we move forward, because of the pace of change, are increasing, right? We all know this graph here. We also know that we don't know exactly where peak population sits. We know it's more than we have now on the planet, and so the demand from our species on the rest of the planet will increase. We're already using 50%. What is it going to go up to? How do we increase that efficiency? At the same time, perhaps even more important, we're seeing this. We're seeing the greatest transformation in the history of the planet into the middle class. We're going to double the middle class in the next 20 years. And most of that's going to happen in Southeast Asia, and not in this country. But that has a profound impact on the total consumptive capacity of our species on the rest of the planet. It's a massive transformation, economic, social, and environmental. And so this 3 billion people added to the middle class have significant impacts on a whole bunch of socioeconomic drivers. It's not just adding people to the middle class, though. This is a little too small to read, and I don't have time to go through all the trends, but there's a number of groups that have compiled changes and the rates of changes in major socioeconomic patterns around the world, whether that's GDP, whether that's connectivity, whether it's communications, whether it's paper production, and then also looked at major Earth system trends. And the point I want to make with this is that many of the major sort of trends that we use to monitor the sort of stability or the progress of change are increasing. They increase, the change starts around the 50s for a lot of these, and it keeps going up for many of them. And so the pace of change is increasing. For many scientists, the worry is around leaving an equilibrium, a planetary equilibrium that's been really good for us as a species. So many of you have probably also seen this. This is the last 100,000 years of temperature. What you'll notice about it, and the single point I want to make, is this. The last 10,000 years have been a period of remarkable stability in the planet. Unprecedented, incredible stability, and it's not unfair to say that this is really, this is when the climate system, the planetary system, settles in to a stable state that is that Garden of Eden for humanity. Yeah, humanity, people have been around the planet for 200,000 years, but only just barely. It wasn't until the dawn of agriculture about 10,000 years ago that the human experiment really took off, and that coincides really nicely with this period of relative stability in climate systems, relative stability in planetary systems. The challenge for us currently is that many of the indicators we're seeing in the planetary feedbacks suggest we're leaving that stability, right? And that's the fundamental, that's where planetary boundaries comes from, that's where resilience science comes from. This is the evolution of our thinking on how the planetary system can support people and the rest of the world we depend on. So what does this say about how we should do research? I mean, that's the fundamental question. Is this increasing pace of change, should it demand from us different ways of organizing our research, different ways of integrating our knowledge and discovery with different aspects of society? And if so, what are those? How can we look forward? What are the principles? How do we do it? When I think of this question, I go back to James Luchenko's paper, which is now 15 years old, and is as prescient and important today as it was 15 years ago. It's actually a great read right now. It's as great a read as it was 15 years ago. Long before people were talking about science in the Anthropocene, Jane laid out arguments for a social contract for science in a human dynamic. What does it mean to be in the position that we're in within this pace of change, when information is needed at a more rapid pace? The urgency, like I said, just as great today as it was before, but figuring out how we can be as effective as possible as individuals, as collectives, as institutions, this is the nugget of the problem. Our communities are diffuse, and our organizational capacities are only as great as our willingness to organize. We haven't quite cracked that nut. So the good thing about it, I think, is that there really has never been a better time to be engaged in this kind of work. And I say that for the simple fact that many more sectors of society are paying attention. They're paying attention to the work that scientists are doing, and they're asking more of science. At a really rapid rate, we're being asked to do more. Whether our research is focused on energy, on disease, or food and water security, we're being asked to build scenarios and predictions that link our actions to their ecological and economic consequences. So that's a hard thing for an individual scientist to do, because most of us either study ecology or economics, physical science or the natural sciences. So this demands some form of team science right up. But it's even bigger than this, really, because I think more generally, in this time of accelerating global change, society is fundamentally asking for a more action-oriented, use-inspired research that is more effective, predictive, and responsive to the needs of society. That's the ask. And it's not coming from one aspect of society, it's coming from all over. So the question is, how as an organizational, as a diffuse organization of scientists, do we respond to that? How do we move from the study of organisms and landscapes like these to the creation of models like these, whether it's Lyme's disease or predictions of crop productivity across Europe, moving from studies of water scarcity to predictions of water scarcity, where to put wind power. So these are we're being asked to answer questions about not how the world might look, but how it will look. And that's a big ask, particularly in my discipline, ecology. Predictive ecology is a scary thing for a lot of folks. It's not an easy thing to do well, because it's not different in social sciences. Economics has had this problem for a long time, and they can't do the experiments we can. So it's still a problem. And in ecology, and in natural sciences, what we need is models that actually recognize the complexity of the circumstances we're dealing with, incorporate that complexity. And when you think about doing that honestly, you are talking about in ecology a fundamental inclusion of a huge amount of natural history data that we don't spend enough time really organizing or collecting or sharing. And in doing that means we have to work closer together. This in itself, I think, is a lot of people are trying to do this, but there's a lot of operations that are trying to make it better. But it's actually only about half the problem, because we also have to go from models like these to get the results and recode these colors into actual sort of decision points for communities like these. So when you're doing Lyme's disease risk, you have to figure out how those results get to the CDC. It's not enough just to produce a paper anymore. Or if it is, we have to find a system to get those results to practice a lot faster than we did 50 years ago. The same thing if you're doing crop stability or crop predictions in Europe, you need to get to DEFRA, you need to get to the European Agricultural Funds for Rural Development. If you're looking at things like water scarcity and models of water scarcity, water risk is Coca-Cola's bottom line, and they need to be brought into that conversation. The same thing with Berkshire Hathaway and the Inter-American Development Bank. That's who funds wind power in the New World. How do they get into that equation? How do you bring those people in? And I know, like a lot of people are going, yeah, I'm still trying to figure out tick behavior. That's the heart. That's my nugget. How on earth is an individual going to do this? And I think that's a fair question. And so I want to get into sort of what this looks like a little bit. So first of all, I think it's important to recognize what we do and what we don't control as scientists. And I'm going to take my discipline as ecologist. 7.3 billion people spread across this map here. That's ecology. That's maybe 30,000 ecologists in the world. It's about 5%, or no, about 0.5% of the global academic community, which is like this. Most of us are academics in ecology, about 70%. All of us would consider ourselves scientists, which is an overlapping community of similar size. These are our home tribes. Most of us in the room probably would say, yeah, that's my tribe one way or another. And ecology is this small part of that much bigger tribe. And so, first of all, that requires us to work much more collaboratively in order to create results that are synthetic enough to influence decision makers than we might otherwise be comfortable working. The problem is even bigger to some extent when you put it into perspective, because this community is trying to translate its results to influence people like this, right? And while, Barack Obama might actually be quite comfortable and happy holding Tony's koala, he's not an ecologist, right? And actually, the tribes that make up the political elite around the world are not ecologists, right? You don't see a lot of them in power. Here's 6 countries here, and the yellow here is the percentage of the leading academics who are leading political elite that are academics. You'll see that there's a lot of business folks in there. There's a lot of law, especially in the United States. But let me make this a little bit more clear for you. This is a percentage. That's what it looks like for academics. In the Senate, there aren't any academics. No scientists. In the House of Representatives, we have 3 and 6 engineers. And we have more people that graduated with a high school education that have PhDs in our leadership, right? So this is the community that we're trying to communicate with. And tribes do well communicating within their tribe, and are challenged when they cross tribes, right? That's just fundamental of who we are. So this is not an easy ask at all. I want to talk about, so that's the problem, that's the sort of what I'm thinking about the social contract and the sort of the challenges we face. And I want to talk about sort of individual and collective models for how we sometimes meet those challenges as a community. And I'll do a little bit talking about sort of this individual impact model. And I think folks who are involved in the SOGIS fellowship program know firsthand about some of the ways in which SOGIS and the Leopold Group and Smith Fellows and Liberero and Luke Hoffman Fellows and others try to build stronger leaders out of emerging scientists, right? To give them skills that they wouldn't otherwise have, to be able to interact more effectively with decision makers outside of their tribe. And I think that's an incredibly important and fundamentally insufficient way for our response. So, and then I'll also talk about the collaborative model. So just to frame it, this is how we often think about the sort of transfer of knowledge from discovery to policy and practice. Scientists come up with a problem they think is important, they do research on it, they produce knowledge that is relevant to that problem, and then magically it's transferred, adopted, and diffused in the policy and practice community. It's really a great ecosystem, except that you put a whole bunch of money in here and get a small amount of societal benefits out the other side. And that's what we're trying to change, increase the societal benefits for the same amount of input. When we think about, anyone who's had a sort of a contentious paper accepted into a major journal knows that that's not how it actually works, right? Because what it works is a lot more like this. It's a spider web. You get a big paper, it immediately goes into 3 different media sources that spin it all different ways. You have policy brokers like WWF or another organization like CARE spinning it their way. You have media, you have bloggers. And by the way, you're not the only one with an opinion, so a minority view comes in, and now it's an us versus them, and that's moving forward. And then that, if you're lucky, goes further to more media people. You get some activated public involved. These are people who actually have connections with decision makers, and they want to push that agenda, your agenda, potentially, if they understand it, up to those decision makers. And that's good, and you know you're making progress when the lawyers get involved. Because now you're actually starting to get close to decision points in society. And the fact is that this leads to a whole bunch of different types of decision makers, each who need data in different ways, different means, different terms. So there's not one decision maker community out there. And a lot of people look at that and they go, no thank you. Like, that is just fundamentally bruising. I would rather go back and just continue to produce knowledge and hope that that pipeline is working well enough. Right? Because it's not an easy process to handle on your own. So this is sort of part of the problem. Well, okay, no, he's not just part of the problem. He's also part of the solution. But a lot of scientists, and I could put my picture of myself up there in certain times, are not fundamentally equipped to do all of that chain, to work directly with decision makers. And I think first thing to recognize is that there actually is, a common ancestor between decision makers and scientists. It was, presumed an extinct species for a long time. It's called Renaissance man, and it's a group that actually was able to communicate really well with decision makers and do fundamental science. The demands of science actually make the creation and the building of Renaissance man really difficult in modern scientific culture, because there's not a lot of incentives for the guy looking through the shark's mouth with a Hawaiian shirt to change who he is. There really isn't in academia, because you can be tremendously successful in academia without really thinking that much about how you look to the public. And that's actually kind of a great thing, right? In a lot of fundamental ways, that is really cool. But it also means that change is not easy for this community. And it's also, there are a few signposts and obvious opportunities for people who do want to change. The other bit we have to overcome is the fact that what we're really asking the modern scientists to do is be extremely productive in an extremely competitive marketplace that is science. And if you want to really get to Renaissance man, you've got to start giving interviews, you've got to start testifying before Congress, you should be blogging, you should be using social media, and you've got to form all these partnerships, right? Oh, and by the way, do that science. Don't slack off on that, right? That's only successful for a small wedge. It helps everyone to know these skills. Not everyone can take on the full spectrum of that. And it's just not a fair ask, I think, for academia to be able to say, now you must be also, Jim Lair or someone else who's like a fantastic interview giver. Like, that's just not going to work for everyone. So that's where I think there's also, so what ends up happening is we work well potentially between disciplines, but not very well between decision makers and those disciplines. And that's where I think, a collective model is actually really important. That's where you start talking about boundary organizations, about the fact that what you need is a framework in which really good science can both be influenced in direction and focus by folks who need answers to questions on a specific timetable so that decisions can be made, and so that evidence can move from science capacity over to policy and practice capacity. There are a lot of these type of organizations out there that try to do this work. Some folks in the room, I bet actually all the active scientists are actually connected in one way or another, if they think about it, to some organization that's involved in this process. But we probably don't see that connection as a fundamental part of our scientific work, and we rarely get credit for it in academia. It's changing, and actually at CSU it's probably you get more credit for it than you would in an organization that wasn't a land grant organization. So there are changes, even there are opportunities. There's also a lot of boundary organizations out there, like some that are more focused on natural science, some that are more focused on social science, some that are administered primarily by governments, others that are more non-governmental. I want to talk a little bit about Future Earth because it's one that probably not a lot of people do know about. It's one that I've stepped into just in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and it's one that has at its core this idea of building the community of researchers and allowing greater effectiveness of research making in society. So just a little bit of history. And Dennis knows this history probably better than anyone in the room, so I'm going to do a very short job so I make as few mistakes as possible. I would say that there's 35 years of international global change research and a whole community that's developed over that 30 or 35 years that supports this work. This is work around the world that seeks to connect communities to create an understanding of how the world works. And it started really with World Climate Research Program, working primarily on climate systems and on understanding of planetary dynamics. Through time, that program had morphed to include more interaction with the biosphere as well. So you have geosphere and biosphere linking natural sciences, primarily ecosystem services and carbon and nitrogen dynamics. Biodiversity was included as a key component, and the recognition of that came in the 90s as it needed its own champion. And biodiversity itself was something that needed to be understood at a global level and integrated with these other prospects. And then in 96, the International Human Dimensions Program sort of got to the point of like, oh, and humans, they got to be in there somewhere, right? So this is an evolution of a community, moving primarily from the physical sciences, including the natural sciences, including more natural sciences than the social sciences, to finally form a union to increase their impact in 2001. And then, again, recognizing that we needed more than a union, we need sort of an all-in approach. We need a new sort of structure for magnifying the impact of global change research around the world and expanding the tent. And that's what FutureGrid is. So it was only established in 2013, and a lot of the details of how we can do that are still in process. And there's some urgency now at getting all those details nailed down and finding a way to catalyze and activate the various communities around the world who are looking for greater impact with their research and through their connections with other researchers, and through connections with societal partners. So I sum up the impact, the focus is on increased impact for integrated international research on sustainability and planetary health. But there's several other ways you could frame it. I think part of the key here is that it is an international endeavor. It's a 10-year project to sort of elevate the impact, elevate the impact and the scope of research and research to action that is done in the name of planetary health and sustainability. And it's one that is explicitly taking on issues of co-design more than it has in the past. This idea that in order to solve the problems of the world, you actually need to work with all sorts of different aspects of society to come up with what the right questions to ask are. Science is often a model in which we come up with the questions to ask on our own and then go out and provide results and then figure out who needs them. This is a little bit of trying to figure out what is needed and then building science back up off of that as much as possible. It's still, so that's the basic fundamental bit. And I want to talk about what it should provide to communities like this, just a little bit. I think the idea, and this is basically my pitch of why we would need an organization like this, what this would provide that you may or may not currently have. Inclusive communities, access to these communities that are focused on transformation. We all have disciplinary societies we go to. Well, what Future Earth is proposing is a society that's based on the fundamental interest in transformation towards a more sustainable sort of interaction with the planet. That being a part of your primary identifier, not just your discipline. We need the disciplines, but we need the disciplines on this effort. Co-design solutions-focused research and frameworks and support for doing that work. This work is not at all trivial to do well, and so figuring out how to support groups who want to work directly with stakeholders or societal partners and help them do a more efficient job doing that is part of what our remit should be. Increased access to funding for use-inspired, transdisciplinary research, stuff that comes from, again, those societal partners, and then crosses disciplines. And then global, regional, and national networks connecting researchers to other researchers and other disciplines, and researchers to societal partners or stakeholders. And I recognize that those are different words and have different connotations for a lot of folks. I think probably societal partners is a better term there. I would also say that access to international policy processes and communities of practice is critical. One of the things about science is that we write the paper when the paper is finished. But the thing about decision communities is they make the decision when they have to make the decision. And if your paper's not there on time, you don't get to play. And so being able to create an ecosystem in which we're both more aware of each other's work in this space so that critical research gets into the process rapidly. We just simply don't have time for it not to anymore. So that's part of the trick, is how do we grease this wheel to make sure this ecosystem works more effectively? And then, fundamentally, if we're going to promote the impact of this kind of work, we have to be able to promote its impact in communities that rely on media, right? That rely on communications, that rely on capacity building. Okay. at the end of the day, I think what Future Earth needs to become is an opportunity for the global change research community writ large to participate in an international, solutions-focused, shared research agenda. And to help shape that agenda. So it has to be a bit of an open tent for it to be successful. Okay, I want to, right now, Future Earth has basically 8 focal challenges that were developed through a pretty lengthy global stakeholder or societal partner engagement process to understand how different parts of society, including quite a bit of sciences, sees the challenges and to align them with other major processes going on, like the SDGs and like the Sustainable Development Goals and other major international processes that involve environment and development. So resilient cities, human health and planetary health, consumption and production, natural capital, food, energy, water, and decarbonization or climate change. If you have resilient cities, when you have a mass, large-scale exodus from rural landscapes, what happens to make those productive places as well? And then fundamentally focusing on risk and governance as a part of the sort of major sort of core initiatives. I'm not going to bore the audience with a whole bunch of the structural ideas that are under consideration. I do want folks to ask questions who are interested in how we see ourselves working. I don't think all the answers are actually there yet, and part of the excitement of Future Earth is having the opportunity to help put those answers in place, and there's some urgency to create those answers and nail them down for the community. But I want to make a point about the kinds of goals that are under each one of these. So I'm just going to show you 2 to show the sort of nature of them. Because I want to point out that they're really international, they're interdisciplinary, and they're transdisciplinary, meaning they include knowledge to action and creation. So this is just 2 of them here. Safeguard natural assets underpinning human well-being by understanding relationships between biodiversity, ecosystem functioning, and services. So this is what I would call the natural sciences bit, but it's hugely interdisciplinary. And it's been a vexing problem for folks in that field for 20 years easily. And there's also strong amounts of social sciences in there because and developing effective valuation and governance approaches. That's the whole scope, right? That's the whole university. That's a lot of university people working together. Food, energy, water, deliver water, energy, food for all, and manage the synergies and trade-offs among them by understanding how these interactions are shaped by environmental, economic, social, and political changes. There's some natural sciences in there. I can see where I fit in. I can't do it alone. I can't do any of it alone, right? I need a lot of different people. Okay. So I want to switch gears a little bit. I think we're check my time here really quick. I think we're fine. Yeah. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about. I sort of laid out some challenges. I've laid out some individual and collective actions or groups that are trying to figure out how to solve those challenges. And I want to switch a little bit and talk a bit about how we stack up currently, and I'm going to do that from the perspective of an ecologist for a bit to say. We talked about international, we talked about interdisciplinary, and those are 2 things that every field has to struggle with. How do we promote that kind of behavior in our field? Because we feel like, the premise here is that kind of research will help benefit society more, or we need more of that kind of research in order to get those results we're looking for at a synthetic level in which decision makers can interact. So that's this impact and linkages across countries and disciplines. So I recently just teamed up with Elsevier and their Scopus database and did a little bit of snooping around. So what this graph shows is, there are about 40,000 papers published in the ecology journals each year from about 2009 to 2013. And these are on the y-axis, and then there are about 20,000 journals, period, in the Scopus database in other fields that also published similar numbers of articles around that time period. So what this data here is looking at, the percentage of papers in ecology journals with international collaborations as a function of how that fits with all the other academic fields that are covered by Scopus, which is basically everything we do as academics. Not quite, but a pretty good survey of them. And what you see is that in ecology, international collaborations, measured by the author list of the papers, are more common than in many other disciplines, than in the average of all disciplines combined. We're a pretty international bunch. And if you think about it, we actually are incentivized to be that international. So this is essentially the citation impact of international collaborations in ecology. So how versus citation impact of all of ecology. So this is individual citations of papers. And on this axis is if you have international collaborators, Do you get cited more often or less often? And the fact that you're above the line means it's more often. And I've grouped all of these points by the country of origin of the lead author. So as you might expect, international collaborations make a huge difference in 2009 in China because it's a relatively insular knowledge community that benefits from exploring with linkage to other quality knowledge communities. And they benefit less in the US and some other in Europe because there's already a lot of flow in those knowledge communities, right, as you might expect. But, and if you sort of walk this forward through time, you can see that they all sort of move up through time. That's just simply looking at what happened from 2009 to 2013. So what you see is that citation impact goes up everywhere, but not equally everywhere. And you can start to see which countries are sort of leading in this field of ecology in relation from the standpoint of citation impact. So we're international. We actually benefit from being international. It fits within our reward structure. Showing here, I'm going to do the same thing here now for interdisciplinarity. And interdisciplinarity is a little bit tricky. The way in which the Scopus database plays with this is they take all the citations that you used in your paper, and they look at all the journals that are associated with those citations. And every journal has a field. And so the most interdisciplinary journals are the ones that cite papers, are the ones that cite journals, cite a whole bunch of different journals to make their argument. And and vice versa for less interdisciplinary. What you find is that across all of these different countries, all disciplines, if you take the top, say, 10% of most interdisciplinary journals, this is how the countries rang out across all disciplines. This is what it is for ecology. And so basically, what this says is ecology is relatively insular. We tend to cite more ecology when we're doing ecology. We don't work out of our discipline as much as some other fields do. That probably doesn't come as a surprise to many ecologists in the room, and it probably really doesn't come to us as a surprise to folks in social sciences, for example. So there's some, and if you actually look at the same kind of citation issue, what you find is that the most interdisciplinary journals papers in ecology don't get cited as much. So again, we're behaving within our sort of reward structure. We're not very interdisciplinary because we kind of get punished for being really interdisciplinary in terms of citations. And that's sort of one of the obstacles I think we need to overcome as a community if we're going to promote an interdisciplinary culture. Right? How do we make sure we reward that kind of behavior in our culture? There's details of this I could go into, but it's a sort of a first cut. So I want to give one other look at this. Is there sort of, all right, if we're thinking about ecology, how does science get used on the other side? So we can take another approach and say, we can look at how we cite each other, which is useful, but ultimately doesn't say anything about who's using our data. It's it's how we measure each other as scientists. It's not how research is used in the world. And recently, I worked with a couple of colleagues to go through almost 300, a little over 300 different reports, and on all the major NGO sort of major state of the world reports, and figure out where does the evidence in these reports come from? Where does science reach the environmental community at the front lines in which they're reporting to their stakeholders, to their decision makers? Because these reports have a lot wider circulation among decision makers than most of our academic journals. So what you find, first of all, is that most of the citations aren't peer-reviewed at all. That most of the evidence that's used to create arguments in at least the conservation community doesn't go through the peer-reviewed space, at least not directly. And that might be a little bit worrying to us as academics. It might be worrying for a couple of reasons. It means that there's actually potentially a parallel information community out there that is not connected to the primary discovery community which we're an intimate part of. And there's more work to be done to figure out how many of those gray literature citations actually trace back to a peer-reviewed citation later on. Fundamentally, what science has to offer the world in this space is that reputation economy that is peer-reviewed. So that is our check and balance against other communities that want to just say something, but don't have to sort of support it with the weight of their colleagues saying, yes, I think that's about right. There's nothing undue in that. So the fact that we're not very well represented there as a community is worrying, right? Maybe 19 to 20%, 25% of average citations. And it varies, of course, from the type of, which kind of journal you're looking at. But it never gets above 55% or so. It's also, I think, important to think about, so not surprisingly, journals that are focused on conservation communities get cited more, conservation biology, right? But ecology has this, and then nature and science, and then you have all these ecology journals that are actually cited in a lot of these reports. So ecology as a discipline does really well. And if you actually shift it around and ask questions like, what type of science is most likely to be in these conservation reports, what you find is that if you're a natural scientist, you publish in journals that are mostly natural science journals, you're much more likely that data is getting used a lot in the conservation community. If you're a social scientist, not so much, right? Not so much right now. Maybe 10 to 1. 1 in 10 citations come with journals that are actually, thinking of themselves in a social science context. I think that may be good if you're an ecologist and really bad if you're a conservationist. Like, I don't think we're going to solve these problems by just figuring out where the bugs and beetles are in the world. I think we have to figure out how humans behave just as much and bring those things together. It's a coarse analysis, but it shows that there's, I think, a lot of work to do there. So I ended by sort of saying that these challenges are both international, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary. And I'm just going to give a very short sort of story about a project that I helped establish in the Leukoffen Institute, part of a much bigger group that Diana sort of alluded to, just because it's illustrative of the kind of science that I think we want our funding agencies to think about how they like support. So the question, of course, is many people have heard about the impacts of palm oil on the world. A lot of people just don't want to use it. But it has large-scale impacts in many parts of the world. But you don't actually know how the palm oil ecosystem is put together unless you actually talk to the people involved in that ecosystem. And it's, of course, not the same everywhere around the world. So we at the Leukoffen Institute worked with EPFL and ETH Zurich and a number of other partners, local universities, other NGOs, to put together a project that looked at palm oil in 3 different social contexts, both in Indonesia, where you hear a lot about it, also in Cameroon and in Colombia. And the reason I bring this up is that we basically wrote a proposal to the Swiss National Science Foundation that said, we have no idea what to study here. We're going to bring together stakeholders and societal partners in each of these 3 contexts. We're going to build models of the coupled system that links palm oil to economics, to environment, to livelihoods. And then we're going to study the unknowns in those systems so that we can understand and provide knowledge back into those systems so that they can use it. And when I helped write it, and I was like, there's no way we're going to get this funded. Because there's no question. But they funded it, and I was like, that's a cool idea. The fact that a science organization is willing to take a chance that by going first to the communities that need the information, and then designing the science from that, you can create value for society in a way that we're not used to doing and we're not trained to do as academics. And it looks a lot like this when you start. Getting people from 3 different continents together to sit down in a room to understand how palm oil works in different social contexts. And you realize, of course, that palm oil is really a huge problem in Indonesia and an incredibly valuable economic driver in Colombia that has minimal ecological impacts in that place. So we tend to blanket this issue and a lot of issues with wide brushes. Until you dig into the stakeholders, you can't get past that to find out the information that's really needed. So, in general, then, I think we can agree on there are a lot of really big challenges, right? All of us can probably agree on what's up there. You all could add 1 or 2 other big challenges in there in environmental stuff. We also sort of can agree on what we're kind of looking for. These healthy landscapes, freshwater systems and oceans, clean air, just, equitable societies, livable cities, healthy people. Who's not going to like this? So this is what we're all shooting for as a global society. What I think that scientists sometimes haven't sort of wrapped their heads around is that this in the center is not just a lack of, the fact that we're trying to get between this, it's not just lack of knowledge. It's not knowledge that is the missing gate between this. And I think of this as being, instead of thinking of science as thinking of science as service, if we think of science as a service industry, that's our job as scientists, is to be providing a service to the world. And that service is knowledge that helps the world get to these solutions more effective. But it doesn't work unless it's also really linked to collaboration, innovation, education, and engagement. And so I think of science as service as being fundamentally transdisciplinary, fundamentally user-focused, co-created, installation-oriented, scalable, and transportable. And I'm going to borrow a saying from Lisa Schulte-Moore, who's a fantastic example of someone who's doing this kind of work here in the United States, at Iowa State, and say that in my experience working both in the NGO for 2.5 years, trying to bring science into that place, and also working here at Future Earth, just starting this, and as an academic, when you really get down to the issues of the solutions to the big problems, we're not shooting for silver bullets. Those aren't out there. I mean, what we're really looking for is silver buckshot, and it's all over. It's little bits that fall into actual systems with real stakeholders and real societal partners to fix problems that matter to individual people. And it's not as if you can take the solution in one place and just pick it up and walk somewhere else and hope it'll work. You like the world to be that simple, but we all know it isn't. And so fundamentally being satisfied that we're going after this silver buckshot together, I think is really what our mission is in a sort of sustainability-focused science community. Okay, so I think actually, because it's now 45 minutes after, I think I could stop there and take questions. This ends at 15. Yeah, I think I'll stop at that point. I left out the natural history. I was hoping I would be able to bring it in. And I'm happy to talk about my views on how natural history is part of the solution another time. But I think I'll stop there. Thanks.